Logic for Homeschoolers, a very brief introduction to basic logic. And we now get to lesson 7 on putting arguments into standard form. Now, we will actually need 2 lessons on this. And this will just be a very basic introduction to the idea and some of the basic principles for putting arguments into standard form. In lesson 8, we'll learn the right techniques for doing this in the best way. Now, what are we even talking about? What's the point of this lesson? The point is arguments are not always written or stated in such a way as to make it very clear just how the premises are supposed to support their conclusion. Sometimes this is a very bad thing. Sometimes arguments are given with an extreme lack of clarity, and it's just terrible. And people who study logic have to fix it, or people who have studied logic and then are using that in the rest of their lives have to fix it. But it's not necessarily bad if an argument is not given in such a way as to make it as clear as possible how the premises are supposed to support their conclusion. There's no reason we should write and talk like robots all the time. It's okay to have some rhetorical flourishes and other departures from straightforward logic in an argument. Still, when you're studying logic, we have to do better than that with respect to making it as clear as possible how the premises of an argument are supposed to support their conclusion. Now, that means we have to put arguments into a form where it's as clear as possible how the premises support their conclusion. And there are rules for doing this. And those rules are rules for putting arguments into standard form. And standard form is our first vocabulary term for this lesson. An argument is in standard form when its pattern of reasoning has been made as clear as possible according to the applicable rules and convention. I say first, I'm not sure I'll give you any more vocabulary words in this lesson. Anyway, an argument is in standard form when its pattern of reasoning has been made as clear as possible according to the applicable rules and conventions, and different rules and conventions will apply to different arguments. And I'm afraid there are some rules and conventions, and some of them are, to some extent, I don't know if I should say they're arbitrary, but at least they're matters of judgment. There are different conventions in different centuries, and maybe to some extent in different textbooks of logic. We always write the conclusion last when an argument is in standard form. I doubt there's been any variation in that rule. We also need to write out any missing steps in arguments if they're enthymemes, and we need to write out any subconclusions. And if you don't know what enthymemes and subconclusions are, go back and watch previous videos in the series. The idea of standard form is best understood not through defining it, but through illustrating it with simple examples. Let's look at 2 versions of this argument. And, I'm going to pause this video and straighten out the text here. And the text actually looked okay in the original document, but I've done so much, what's the word, indentation and zooming in. I've done so much indentation so that I can zoom in so much that it screwed up the formatting. Anyway, let's look at 2 versions of this argument to illustrate the idea of standard form. Simple argument: Macbeth is a big jerk because only a big jerk would murder a nice guy like Duncan. That's a straightforward enough argument, and it's clear enough, but look at it now in this pattern. All people who murder nice guys like Duncan are big jerks. Macbeth is a person who murders a nice guy like Duncan, so Macbeth is a big jerk. That is a much clearer presentation of the pattern of reasoning. That's what we mean when we put an argument into standard form. We make the pattern of reasoning a whole lot clearer. And if you're like, I think a number of people are, I think I was like this in the old days, you think it's still not clear enough. You're going from Macbeth to people who murder nice guys like Duncan to big jerks. And so you should put the argument in that order. Well, we can. And we can thus put into standard form the argument Macbeth is a big jerk because only a big jerk would murder a nice guy like Duncan in this way. Premise 1, Macbeth is a person who murders a nice guy like Duncan. Premise 2, all people who murder nice guys like Duncan are big jerks. Conclusion, so Macbeth is a big jerk. This is actually not the normal convention. So this is close enough to standard form for today. But on another day, we would actually learn that the original way was better. Not necessarily better in every way. It's easier to think in these ways. Macbeth, people who murder nice guys like Duncan, people who are big jerks. That's the order of reasoning in the argument itself. That's the order in which we could place the terms of the argument when we put it into standard form. It's easier to think through it that way, but it's not necessarily easier to test the argument for validity using all the methods we have to learn when we study categorical logic, although I don't know how many methods we'll get to in this series. I'm trying to keep this series pretty short and very basic. Anyway, all that to say, yeah, this is a good way of putting the argument into a more orderly form. Not quite standard form, but close enough for our purposes for now. But it's actually not quite up to the par of the conventions. Anyway, let's see. Note what we've done when we put it into standard form. We've written the conclusion last. Macbeth is a big jerk. We've added a so. We could have just as easily said therefore. Therefore and so are the standard conclusion indicators that you should have as a rule when you write out the conclusion of an argument in standard form. And when you write it last, also, I think it's much better if you have a comma there. All right, and what else did we do? We split up the premises into their own sentences. That's another terribly important thing to do when you put an argument into standard form. Now, it should be easier in this arrangement of the argument to see how the premises give support to the conclusion. We can see that this argument has the pattern. X is Y and all Y are Z, so X is Z. When we fill in the unstated premise, we write the conclusion last and so on. It's easier to see how terms like Macbeth, people who murder nice guys like Duncan, and big jerks are all connected. It's easier to see how these terms are connected when we write the argument in standard form. Let's see. Unstated premises. Yeah, I didn't even mention that. Look what we do when we put this thing into standard form. We write the conclusion last. We split up premises into their own individual sentences, but also, in order to do that in the first place, we fill in the unstated premise. This premise wasn't stated. Macbeth is a person who murders a nice guy like Duncan. That was not even stated in the original argument. So you definitely have to spell that out and write each premise as its own statement. Here's another example. Let's see. I think I know what to expect, so I'll just straighten out the formatting much more quickly without pausing the recording. Here is a simple example. Here's an argument. Lady Macbeth is super creepy. It takes an epic level of creepiness to give the unsex me speech she gives, but she gave it anyway. That's a simple enough argument. It's fairly clear how the premises are supposed to support the conclusion, but it's still not quite in standard form, and it should be a little easier to see what is the pattern of reasoning here if we write it out. Just a moment. I didn't quite put it into proper form. Now we have it in proper form. If someone gives the unsex me speech, she's super creepy. Lady Macbeth gives the unsex me speech, so Lady Macbeth is super creepy. Now, it looks like this is a pretty simple if-then argument, but it's easier to see that when we put it into standard form. Alternatively, it might be better to think of this argument not as something in statement logic. And I'm not going to pause and review all the terms, go back and watch previous videos, but this, just for illustration purposes, this argument with Macbeth was categorical logic. This argument I just did with Lady Macbeth is statement logic. At least that's how I was putting it into standard form. But sometimes an argument could be interpreted either way. And this is why, if we had all the world, had we whirled enough in time, as the poet says, I think that's how he says it. Had we whirled enough in time, it would be good to learn statement logic, categorical logic, and then the more advanced system that combines tools of both, predicate logic, and then we wouldn't have any issue here. Anyway, what was I saying? Some arguments could be represented, formalized as categorical or statement logic. This is one of those. I just did it as an if-then statement logic argument, but maybe it's better as a categorical logic argument, or maybe I should say categorical reasoning. Yes, that would be better terminology. Some arguments can be formalized as arguments using categorical reasoning or statement reasoning, propositional reasoning. This one is one of those. Let's put it in categorical logic now. And I think we'll find it has the same pattern as that first Macbeth argument. All right, here is that argument in categorical logic. Lady Macbeth is super creepy. Takes an epic level of creepiness to give the unsex me speech, but she gave it anyway. All people who give the unsex me speech are super creepy people. Premise one, and then premise two, Lady Macbeth gives the unsex me speech. premise. 3, conclusion, rather. Therefore, Lady Macbeth is a super creepy person. That is the categorical logic version of this argument, and I think it's probably better than the statement logic version. Now, these more standardized arguments have not gone all the way into standard form yet. We learned later how to finish the job, both for statement logic and categorical logic. And I should say that for this particular series, we might not actually learn later how to finish the job, but I'll try to give you at least some sort of a brief lesson in categorical logic and some sort of a brief lesson in statement logic before this series ends, though I'm not planning on going into much detail in this series. There's a longer series, the Lessons in Logic series, which will go into enormous detail. So what's the plan? How do we put arguments into standard form? To some extent, this means paraphrasing. Putting arguments into standard form does involve a lot of paraphrasing, but it is more than that. And here's a list of steps for getting the job done, largely borrowed from The Power of Logic by Lehman, Wasserman, and the Howard Snyders. Step 1 for putting an argument into standard form, identify the conclusion. And you really should do this first. There are very, very, very few exceptions to the rule. Always identify the conclusion first. Now, how do you identify the conclusion? Well, you can pay attention to the conclusion indicators. That will help. Usually if the word therefore or the word so or the word thus is in an argument, it will signal a conclusion. And look for the proposition supported by all the others. That's even more important. It's a little subtler, maybe. Conclusion indicators are simpler, faster to work with, but less decisive. What's really decisive is the proposition supported by all the others. It's probably the conclusion. And if it's not the conclusion, then the argument is really badly done. So next step, identify the premises. Pay attention to the premise indicators, but also, more importantly, and if there's any ambiguity, pay attention to the statements that support the conclusion. Look at which statements support which statement. The one supported by all the others is the conclusion, and all the other ones are premises to it. Include any unstated steps. Don't leave the argument in an enthymematic form. If I tell you, let's go back to our examples. Actually, this was not given as an enthymeme, was it? Lady Macbeth is super creepy. Conclusion. It takes an epic level of creepiness to give the unsex me speech, but she gave it anyway. Okay. That is not an enthymeme. Both premises were stated, the conclusion was stated, but this one was an enthymeme. Macbeth is a big jerk because only a big jerk would murder a nice guy like Duncan, and the explicit statement that Macbeth did murder Duncan is not given in this form of the argument. You have to spell it out when you make it, when you put the argument into standard form. Next step, get rid of any extra language. Get rid of things like these. Here are some different kinds of extra language that can be included. There is such a thing called a discount. A discount is a recognition of something that might weaken the argument in some way. Let's use our technical terminology, and let me not just say weaken in normal English, because this is logic class. We can't always use normal English. Weak has a technical meaning. An argument might be rendered invalid, weak, unsound, or uncogent by something. So if I say, I could be wrong, or unless I'm mistaken, that is a discount. And then there is an assurance. An assurance indicates the author's confidence in a premise or an inference. Trust me. If you haven't read Macbeth, and you don't know what is his character, or if you were talking to me the first time I read Macbeth, and I'm reading the first few pages of the story, and I'm like, okay, Macbeth's great. Macbeth's awesome. Macbeth's the hero of this battle. Macbeth's a good guy. He's going to be the hero of this story. No one had ever lectured me on Macbeth before I read it. So I'm thinking, Macbeth's the hero of this story. I think Macbeth's going to be the good guy, you know, a tragic flaw that ends up getting everyone killed or something like that, maybe, but he's not going to be the villain. That's what I'm thinking. I was very far into the story before I realized, oh my gosh, this guy is the villain of the story. But he starts off so well. It really is a tragedy. It's the difference between, I suppose, Hamlet, who's still sort of the hero from the beginning to the end, flawed, but a hero, more or less, and Macbeth, who starts off good and turns super bad. It's why Uh, it's why the Godfather trilogy can count as a tragedy. It's like Macbeth. All right. Anyway, I'm getting way off topic here. I got to get my brain together. All right. So say I'm introducing Macbeth to someone who hasn't read it, like possibly some of you, and I say, trust me, I've read it. I love that story, and I've read it a number of times and seen a couple of the movies. Trust me, Macbeth is a big jerk. Only a big jerk would murder a nice guy like Duncan. I tell you that, and I say, trust me, because you're wondering after hearing how great he is from the first couple pages of the story. You're wondering, what? How is he going to be the bad guy? And I tell you, trust me, he's a big jerk. And then I explain why he's a big jerk. Only a big jerk would murder a nice guy like Duncan. And then you're like, what? He murders Duncan? Yeah, he does. Spoilers. I should have done a spoiler alert at the beginning of this. Not that this isn't very old information. Anyway, indicating the author's confidence, though, does not actually contribute to the argument. It doesn't contribute to the logic. It's rhetorically useful, or it can increase clarity of communication, or what is the argument about, who's talking to whom, and why are we talking, and what's the nature of our conversation. A lot of clarity can be added with these things. It can be added in these areas by things like trust me or discounts. But strictly speaking, they're not part of the logic. They don't support the conclusion. They are not part of the conclusion, same as a hedge. A hedge indicates that an arguer is tentative about something, like until I learn otherwise, as far as I can tell. And repetition, that happens as well. You might find a premise stated twice, or a conclusion stated twice. Lady Macbeth is super creepy. It takes an epic level of creepiness to give the unsex me speech, but she gave it anyway. So creepy. So when I say so creepy at the end, that's a repetition of the conclusion. And not even a full repetition of that. Just cut it out. You don't need it. Use uniform language throughout the argument. Next step. Don't use different words for the same categories, or different phrasing for atomic statements. Simple statements not made of any other statements. Don't say Macbeth is a bad guy and Macbeth is a bad man. Just pick one and go with it anytime you use it. Don't say Lady Macbeth in one premise and then Mrs. Macbeth in another. Just pick one and go with it every time you refer to her. Write all propositions in standard form. Next step. Yes, the premises and conclusions the statement an argument is made of have their own standard form, and we talk about this more later. And if we don't get to it much in this series, at least it's in the bigger series, Lessons in Logic, that should by now be fully aired on my channel. For now, though, until you learn details for putting statements into standard form, at least make sure you write everything in declarative mood sentences. No rhetorical questions, no exclamations. And be fair and charitable to arguers. Try to represent the arguer's actual intention, and as a rule, write out an argument that would be more difficult to refute. Don't confuse sub-conclusions with final conclusions. Write the conclusion last. Check your work when you're finished. And then that other thing that I mentioned orally but haven't written down that I really need to add to my notes. So I will type it up now. Write out each premise as its own sentence. All right, these are the things you should do to put an argument into standard form. Now, there's a more detailed way of doing this, a more rigorous way of doing this, which we hope to get to in the next lesson. This list doesn't cover everything. It's just a place to get started. Putting arguments into standard form is largely a matter of skill and not just rule following. You need practice. So, of course, when my kids get to this part of my textbook I'm writing for them, they'll have some homework to practice with. And if you want any homework, at some point I will integrate it somewhere into something. Maybe I'll put it in the textbook itself. Maybe I'll have it in a file to share alongside the textbook. And if you want it and or the textbook, Plato and Augustine at gmail.com. Okay, that's all. Thanks for watching.